There are roads that humanity has walked for millennia, paths worn smooth by countless feet, moving in the same direction toward the same distant horizon. These are the ways of tradition, of collective wisdom, of shared belief that binds communities together under common banners of meaning. Then there are other roads, ones that veer away from the well-traveled routes, that wind through territories marked with warning signs and guarded by the sentinels of convention. These are the paths less discussed, less celebrated, and often deliberately obscured from view by those who fear what lies beyond the boundaries of acceptable spiritual practice. The distinction between these two roads has ancient origins, emerging from cultures that understood human spiritual development as something far more complex than a single journey toward a single destination. In the Sanskrit traditions of India, practitioners spoke of two hands, two approaches, two fundamentally different orientations toward the divine and the self. The right hand represented one way, and the left hand represented another. This was not merely symbolic convenience, but a recognition that consciousness itself could be cultivated through divergent methodologies, each with its own internal logic and ultimate aim. The right-hand path, as it came to be known in English translations, emphasized dissolution of the individual ego into cosmic unity. Practitioners following this road sought to transcend personal desires, to purify themselves of what was considered base or worldly, to ultimately merge their consciousness with the absolute through surrender and devotion. The gods were to be worshipped, the scriptures obeyed, the gurus followed without question. Morality was defined by ancient texts and enforced by spiritual hierarchies. The self was viewed as an illusion to be overcome, a temporary aggregation of elements that would eventually dissolve back into the primordial source from which all things emerge. This approach has produced remarkable spiritual literature, profound mystical experiences, and genuinely transformative practices for countless seekers throughout history. It has built temples and monasteries, sustained communities of devotion, and provided frameworks of meaning that have comforted billions in the face of suffering and death. Yet it rests on certain fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the purpose of existence that not all practitioners have found satisfying or even accurate. The left-hand path emerged as a counter-tradition, one that questioned these basic premises. Rather than seeking dissolution, it pursued intensification of individual consciousness. Rather than transcendence of the self, it aimed for apotheosis, the elevation of the individual to divine status. The gods were not masters to be obeyed, but forces to be understood, worked with, or even challenged. Morality was not discovered in ancient scriptures, but created by each practitioner according to their own developing wisdom and will. This was not simple rebellion for its own sake, though it has often been characterized that way by those who misunderstand its principles. The practitioners of the left-hand path recognized that consciousness itself was not an accident of matter, but perhaps the fundamental ground of being. If this were true, then the cultivation and expansion of individual awareness was not spiritual narcissism, but the most profound work a human being could undertake. The self was not illusion, but the only genuine reality available to direct experience. Everything else, including the supposed absolute into which the right-hand practitioners sought to dissolve, was itself filtered through the lens of individual consciousness and therefore potentially a construction rather than an ultimate truth. The terminology itself carries symbolic weight. The left hand in many cultures has been associated with the unconventional, the hidden, the forbidden. It represents that which is outside normal social boundaries, that which operates according to different rules. In societies where the right hand was used for sacred acts and eating, the left hand was reserved for tasks considered impure. This association with transgression and boundary crossing was not lost on those who chose to identify their spiritual practice with leftward orientation. But the path was never simply about violation of taboos for shock value. The transgressive elements that appear in various left-hand path traditions serve specific purposes within comprehensive systems of spiritual development. Breaking social conditioning can reveal the arbitrary nature of many beliefs held to be absolute truths. Confronting forbidden experiences or ideas can catalyze psychological growth and integration of shadow material. What appears as mere rule-breaking from the outside often functions as precise spiritual technology from within. The ancient Tantric traditions of India provide one of the clearest examples of this principle in action. Certain practitioners deliberately engaged in activities forbidden by conventional religious law, consuming meat and alcohol, engaging in sexual rituals, meditating in cremation grounds among the dead. These practices were not indulgences but carefully structured methods for shattering conditioned responses and accessing states of consciousness normally blocked by social programming. The goal was not libertine pleasure but freedom from the unconscious forces that govern ordinary human behavior. Western esoteric traditions developed their own versions of this leftward orientation, though often without direct connection to the Indian sources. When European occultists began systematizing their practices in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found themselves articulating principles that echoed the ancient distinction between right and left approaches. The emphasis shifted from devotion to gods toward commanding spirits, from purification toward integration of all aspects of self, including those deemed dark or dangerous, from submission to cosmic order toward active participation in shaping reality according to will. The figure who perhaps most embodied this Western shift was Aleister Crowley, whose system of Thelema placed individual will at the center of spiritual practice. His famous maxim, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," has been grotesquely misunderstood as license for selfish hedonism, when in fact it represented a profound ethical framework. The true will that Crowley spoke of was not the passing desires of the mundane ego, but the deepest purpose of the individuated consciousness, what one might call the trajectory of the soul through incarnation. To discover and enact this will require years of disciplined practice, rigorous self-examination, and the courage to stand apart from collective programming. This emphasis on individual sovereignty distinguishes the left-hand path from both conventional religion and many alternative spiritual movements. It rejects the idea that salvation or enlightenment can be achieved through submission to external authority, whether that authority is a god, a guru, a sacred text, or a tradition. Instead, it places responsibilities squarely on the individual practitioner to discover truth through direct experience, to develop their own relationship with the numinous, to become their own ultimate authority in matters of consciousness and meaning. The implications of this stance are profound and potentially unsettling. If each individual must discover and create their own path, then there can be no guarantee of safety, no promise that following certain steps will lead to certain results, no insurance against catastrophic error. The left-hand path acknowledges this uncertainty as intrinsic to the work. It recognizes that genuine growth requires risk, that transformation cannot be commodified or made safe, that the greatest spiritual rewards come only to those willing to walk into darkness without guaranteed exit routes. This is perhaps why the left hand has remained the road less traveled despite its appeal to those who chafe under conventional restrictions. It demands more of the practitioner, offers less external support, and carries greater danger of psychological destabilization or spiritual dead ends. There are no congregations to belong to, no shared rituals that guarantee community acceptance, no priests to tell you whether you are progressing correctly. The practitioner stands alone with their own consciousness, their own choices, their own consequences. Yet for those who feel called to this orientation, the rewards justify the risks. The experience of discovering one's own authentic will, of developing genuine magical power, rather than simply petitioning higher powers for favor, of becoming the conscious creator of one's own reality rather than a passive recipient of cosmic forces, represents a kind of fulfillment that cannot be found on more conventional paths. The left-hand path offers not comfort but empowerment, not dissolution but crystallization, not surrender but sovereignty. The historical development of these ideas has been neither linear nor unified. Different cultures have approached the concept of leftward spiritual practice with different emphases, different techniques, different ultimate goals. Indian Tantra, Western Satanism, chaos magic, and various Luciferian traditions all fall under the broad umbrella of left-hand path practice, yet they share few specific doctrines or methods. What unites them is a common orientation, a shared valuing of individual consciousness and will, a recognition that the forbidden and the transgressive can serve as portals to genuine transformation. Understanding this foundational distinction between right and left approaches to spirituality provides context for everything that follows. It explains why certain practices are considered dangerous or heretical by mainstream traditions. It illuminates the logic behind rituals that seem designed to shock or violate social norms. It reveals the sophisticated psychology underlying systems that superficially appear to glorify darkness or evil. The left-hand path is not the opposite of spirituality, but an alternative approach to it, one that begins from different premises and aims toward different destinations. As we journey deeper into these territories, we will encounter practices and philosophies that challenge comfortable assumptions about the nature of consciousness, morality, and ultimate reality. We will explore traditions that embrace darkness rather than seeking to transcend it, that work with forces conventionally labeled as demonic or dangerous, that place the will of the individual above cosmic law. These are not easy teachings to integrate, nor should they be. They represent genuine alternatives to the mainstream spiritual consensus, alternatives that come with both extraordinary potential and significant peril for those who choose to walk the forbidden road. The origins of these leftward practices stretch back thousands of years into the Indian subcontinent, where spiritual experimenters develop methodologies so radical that they remain controversial even today. Within the vast landscape of Hindu and Buddhist practice, certain lineages emerged that deliberately inverted conventional religious values, transforming prohibited acts into sacraments and treating taboos as doorways to liberation. These were the Tantric traditions, and among them the Vamachara, or left-hand practitioners, stood as the most transgressive and misunderstood. Tantra itself represents a complex web of teachings and practices that emerged roughly 1500 years ago, though its roots likely extend much deeper into pre-Vedic shamanic traditions. The word comes from Sanskrit roots meaning to weave or to expand, suggesting both the interconnection of all phenomena and the extension of consciousness beyond ordinary limits. Unlike the ascetic paths that dominated Indian spirituality, Tantra proposed that liberation could be achieved not through rejection of the material world, but through full engagement with it, including aspects conventionally considered impure or spiritually dangerous. The division into right hand and left hand, Tantra, crystallized around differing attitudes towards certain practices. Right-hand tantrics, or dakshinachara practitioners, worked with symbolic representations and internalized rituals, maintaining conventional moral boundaries while pursuing esoteric knowledge. Left-hand tantrics took a more direct approach, one that horrified orthodox society and continues to generate controversy among scholars and practitioners alike. They argued that genuine spiritual transformation required confrontation with everything the conditioned mind feared or rejected. This confrontation took the form of the Panchamakara, the 5 M's, so called because each Sanskrit word begins with the letter Ma. These were Madhya, Matsya, Mamsa, Mudra, and Maithuna. Wine, fish, meat, parched grain, and ritual sexual union. Each violated explicit prohibitions found in mainstream Hindu practice. High caste Brahmins were forbidden alcohol and meat, required to maintain strict dietary purity, and bound by elaborate rules governing sexual conduct. The left-hand practitioners deliberately transgressed each boundary in carefully structured ritual contexts. The logic underlying these transgressions was sophisticated, rooted in theories of consciousness that Western psychology would not articulate for more than a millennium. The Tantrics understood that human behavior operates largely under unconscious control, governed by conditioning absorbed from family and society during early development. This conditioning creates what they called samskaras, deep impressions in consciousness that generate automatic responses to stimuli. Most people live entire lives never questioning these programmed reactions, mistaking cultural conditioning for ultimate truth or natural law. By deliberately engaging in forbidden acts within ritual space, practitioners created opportunities to observe their own conditioning in action. The discomfort that arose when consuming meat or alcohol, the anxiety generated by transgressing sexual norms, the visceral responses to touching substances considered impure. All of these reactions revealed the arbitrary nature of socially constructed categories. What seemed absolute and natural was exposed as learned behavior, no more intrinsically true than any other possible configuration of values and prohibitions. This recognition opened pathways to genuine freedom. If moral categories were cultural constructs rather than cosmic laws, then consciousness itself was more fundamental than any system of ethics. The practitioner could choose to operate according to wisdom rather than programming, responding to situations based on direct perception rather than inherited rules. This did not mean abandoning all ethical considerations, but it did mean taking personal responsibility for moral choices rather than outsourcing that responsibility to tradition or scripture. The sexual practices of left-hand Tantra have attracted disproportionate attention from both critics and curious seekers, often obscuring the broader spiritual framework within which they functioned. Maithuna, the ritual sexual union, was not recreational activity or even sacred sexuality in the contemporary Western sense. It represented a highly technical practice requiring years of preparation, performed within strict ritual parameters, aimed at specific alterations of consciousness. The partners were often not married to each other, violating both monogamy norms and caste restrictions on sexual contact. During the ritual, practitioners worked to maintain meditative awareness while engaging in intense physical experience. The goal was to observe the arising and dissolution of pleasure and desire without becoming lost in sensation, to remain conscious witness even in the midst of overwhelming stimuli. This trained the mind to maintain stability regardless of circumstance, a skill applicable far beyond the ritual context. Additionally, the practices worked with subtle energy systems in the body, using sexual arousal to activate Kundalini force, and directed upward through the chakras towards states of expanded consciousness. The consumption of meat and alcohol served similar purposes, though operating through different mechanisms. Eating beef, in particular, represented the ultimate violation for Hindu practitioners, as the cow held sacred status throughout Indian society. By consuming what was most forbidden, the practitioner shattered the deepest conditioning, experiencing directly that consciousness itself remained untouched by external substances or actions. The practitioner learned to distinguish between the eternal witness and the temporary contents of awareness, between that which could be polluted and that which remained eternally pure. Wine loosened the grip of rational mind, creating liminal states where different modes of knowing could emerge. In controlled ritual contexts with experienced guidance, this dissolution of ordinary consciousness allowed practitioners to access non-dual awareness, states in which subject and object merged into unified experience. The danger was obvious. Alcohol has destroyed countless lives, and using it as spiritual technology required extraordinary discipline and discernment. The left-hand practitioners acknowledged this danger while maintaining that the potential rewards justified the risk for those genuinely committed to the path. Mudra in this context referred to parched grain, though the term has other meanings in different tantric systems. Some scholars suggest it also meant specific hand gestures or even certain types of kidney beans. Regardless of the precise substance, it represented another forbidden food, another opportunity to transcend conditioning through deliberate transgression. The fish similarly violated vegetarian prescriptions that dominated high-caste Hindu practice, adding another layer to the systematic dismantling of conventional religious values. These practices unfolded in cremation grounds, those liminal spaces between life and death where normal social rules broke down entirely. Surrounded by corpses in various stages of decomposition, watching funeral pyres burn through the night, the practitioner confronted mortality in its rawest form. The cremation ground symbolized the dissolution of ego, the inevitable end that awaits all constructed identities. By meditating in such places, by performing rituals among the dead, practitioners accelerated their recognition of impermanence and loosened attachment to the illusion of permanent self. Buddhist Tantra developed parallel practices, particularly in the Vajrayana traditions that flourished in Tibet and surrounding regions. Here too, practitioners worked with transgressive imagery and experiences, visualizing themselves as wrathful deities, engaging in symbolic unions with consorts, wielding ritual implements made from human bone. The underlying psychology remained consistent with Hindu left-hand approaches. Consciousness itself was recognized as primordial purity, and liberation came through direct recognition of this fundamental nature rather than through moral purification or gradual accumulation of merit. The Tibetan traditions added sophisticated philosophical frameworks drawn from Madhyamaka and Yogacara Buddhist schools. They understood all phenomena as empty of inherent existence, mere appearances arising within consciousness without substantial reality. From this view, moral categories were as empty as everything else, useful conventions but not ultimate truths. The practitioner who genuinely realized emptiness could engage in any action without accumulating karma, because karma itself required belief in a substantial self-performing actions with real consequences. This was dangerous teaching, easily misunderstood as license for harmful behavior, and therefore reserved for advanced students who had developed genuine realization and compassion. The sexual imagery throughout Vajrayana Buddhism shocked Western observers when they first encountered it. Statues of deities in sexual union, called yabyum or father-mother representations, adorned temples and appeared in sacred paintings. These were not mere artistic choices, but precise symbolic expressions of non-dual wisdom. The male figure represented skillful means or compassion, the active principle of engaging with the world. The female figure represented wisdom or emptiness, the recognition of the fundamental nature of phenomena. Their union symbolized the inseparability of compassion and wisdom, the integration of active engagement with reality and profound understanding of its empty nature. Actual sexual practices occurred within certain lineages, always under guidance of realized masters who could ensure students did not simply indulge desire under the guise of spiritual practice. The energy generated through sexual union without release was redirected upward through the central channel of the subtle body, activating bliss states that could serve as vehicles for recognizing the nature of mind. These practices demanded extraordinary mental discipline, as the practitioner had to maintain meditative awareness throughout intense physical and emotional experience. The cultural context within which these practices developed cannot be ignored. Ancient India, particularly during the first millennium of the Common Era, sustained remarkable religious pluralism. Competing philosophies debated in royal courts, different sects coexisted in the same cities, and spiritual experimenters enjoyed considerable freedom to develop novel practices and teachings. Within this environment, transgressive approaches could emerge and evolve without immediate suppression, though they certainly generated controversy and opposition from more conservative quarters. Yet even in this relatively tolerant context, left-hand practitioners operated at the margins, often in secret, revealing their methods only to qualified students who had demonstrated readiness through years of preliminary training. The practices were never meant for public consumption or casual experimentation. They represented the culmination of systematic spiritual development, techniques reserved for those who had already established ethical foundations, developed meditative stability, and cultivated sufficient wisdom to navigate dangerous territory without harming themselves or others. The decline of these traditions in India resulted from multiple factors. Islamic invasions disrupted Buddhist communities and destroyed many monastic centers where Tantric teachings were preserved. Hindu reform movements in the modern period rejected Tantric practices as corrupt deviations from pure Vedic spirituality. British colonial authorities viewed Tantra with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, often conflating genuine spiritual practices with criminal activity or sexual exploitation. By the 20th century, authentic left-hand Tantric lineages had become exceedingly rare in India itself, though they persisted in modified forms in Tibet, Nepal, and among scattered practitioners who maintained ancient transmissions. What survived was often diluted or distorted, transformed into either New Age fantasy or academic subject matter stripped of living practice. The profound psychology and sophisticated techniques developed over centuries of careful experimentation became either romanticized as exotic Eastern wisdom or dismissed as primitive superstition. The genuine left-hand path, with its rigorous demands and serious risks, largely vanished from public view, continuing only in hidden lineages or reconstructed forms based on fragmentary textual sources. Understanding these ancient roots provides essential context for everything that developed later in Western left-hand path traditions. The core insights remained consistent across cultures and centuries. Consciousness is primary, conditioning can be transcended, transgression serves as spiritual technology when wielded skillfully, and individual transformation requires confronting rather than avoiding what the psyche fears or rejects. These principles would re-emerge in different cultural clothing, but their essence derived from the radical experimenters who meditated among corpses and transformed forbidden acts into portals of liberation. The transmission of these ideas westward followed circuitous routes through colonial encounters, academic translations, and the fevered imaginations of European occultists who glimpsed fragments of ancient wisdom and reconstructed them according to their own cultural frameworks. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had shattered traditional certainties across Europe, while scientific materialism threatened to reduce consciousness itself to mere mechanical processes. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped seekers who looked beyond Christianity for answers, drawing on Egyptian mysteries, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, and the tantalizing reports of Eastern practices that were beginning to reach Western audiences through scholarly works and travelers' accounts. The British occultist who would become most closely identified with Western left-hand path traditions arrived in this ferment of spiritual experimentation. Aleister Crowley was born in 1875 into a wealthy family of Plymouth Brethren, an austere Protestant sect that would instill in him both deep biblical knowledge and profound rebellion against Christian morality. His journey through Cambridge, his initiation into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, his travels through India and Egypt, and his eventual reception of what he claimed as a new spiritual dispensation would reshape Western occultism and provide a systematic framework for leftward practice outside traditional tantric contexts. Crowley's central revelation came in Cairo in 1904, when he reported receiving a text called the Book of the Law from a non-corporeal intelligence he identified as Aiwas. Whether one interprets this as genuine contact with a separate entity, an eruption from his own unconscious depths, or creative fiction matters less than the impact the text had on subsequent occult practice. The book proclaimed a new aeon, the age of Horus, characterized by the principle, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." This maxim would become the foundation of Thelema, Crowley's systematic magical philosophy, and a cornerstone of Western left-hand path thought. The phrase has been willfully misunderstood by both critics and shallow adherents as permission for hedonistic indulgence or sociopathic disregard for others. Nothing could be further from Crowley's actual teaching. The will referenced in his central axiom was not the passing whims of ordinary desire, but what he termed true will, the fundamental trajectory of the individuated soul through incarnation. Discovering this true will required years of disciplined magical practice, ruthless self-examination, and the systematic stripping away of false selves constructed to meet social expectations or protect psychological wounds. Crowley understood that most people lived entire lives never accessing their genuine will at all. They operated according to conditioning, following scripts written by parents, teachers, religious authorities, and cultural norms. They pursued goals they thought they wanted without realizing these desires themselves were programmed responses rather than authentic expressions of their deepest nature. The true will existed beneath this accumulated debris of social conditioning, waiting to be discovered by those courageous enough to undertake the excavation. The ethical framework that emerged from this teaching was subtle and demanding. If every individual has a unique true will, a particular purpose or trajectory through existence, then morality becomes a matter of alignment rather than obedience. An action is right to the extent it expresses and advances one's true will, wrong to the extent it deviates from or obstructs it. This makes ethics profoundly individual while not devolving into simple relativism, because the true will itself was conceived as an objective reality discoverable through practice rather than a subjective preference one could arbitrarily choose. Moreover, Crowley's system included a second key maxim: love is the law, love under will. This tempering principle suggested that genuine will naturally expresses itself through connection and expansion rather than contraction and harm. The person operating from true will does not find themselves in constant conflict with others because authentic wills are fundamentally compatible, each unique trajectory contributing to a larger cosmic pattern. Conflict arises from false wills, from ego drives and conditioned desires that pull individuals away from their genuine paths. The magical practices Crowley systematized in organizations like the AA and Ordo Templi Orientis provided methods for discovering and enacting true will. These drew heavily on Golden Dawn ceremonial magic, Tantric sexual practices he learned during travels in India, Kabbalistic frameworks, yoga techniques, and his own innovations. The curriculum moved from basic meditation and visualization through increasingly complex ritual work, culminating in operations designed to produce profound alterations of consciousness and direct contact with what Crowley called the holy guardian angel, essentially the higher self or true will personified. Sexual magic occupied a central but carefully guarded place in Crowley's system, reflecting both his tantric influences and his own extensive explorations. He recognized sexual energy as the most potent force available to human consciousness, capable of generating extraordinary magical effects when properly directed. His ninth-degree teachings in the Ordo Templi Orientis involved specific techniques for using sexual arousal and orgasm to charge magical intentions, what he called the production and consecration of the elixir. These practices were reserved for advanced students and shrouded in secrecy, partly from necessity, given legal prohibitions on sexual content in early 20th century Britain. The parallels with tantric practice were clear, though Crowley's approach emphasized will and intention more than the emptiness teachings central to Buddhist Tantra. Where the tantric practitioner aimed to recognize the empty nature of phenomena while engaging in transgressive acts, the Thelemic magician aimed to impose will upon reality, to shape circumstances according to conscious intention. This represented a more overtly Western orientation, valuing action and transformation over recognition and acceptance. Crowley's ceremonial magic also differed from earlier Western occult traditions in its attitude towards spirits and entities. Where medieval grimoires approached demons and angels as independent beings to be commanded through divine authority, Crowley's psychology-inflected approach treated them as aspects of consciousness, externalized for purposes of ritual work. He could operate as if they were real while maintaining philosophical agnosticism about their ontological status. This pragmatic stance freed practitioners from endless metaphysical debates, allowing them to work effectively with whatever model produced results. The broader Western esoteric tradition from which Crowley emerged had been developing its own leftward tendencies throughout the 19th century. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, despite its formal structure and grade system, emphasized individual development and direct mystical experience over dogmatic belief. Its curriculum drew on Egyptian, Greek, and Hebrew sources, synthesizing them into a coherent system of ceremonial magic that placed the practitioner at the center of cosmic drama. Members learned to invoke and banish elemental forces, to travel in vision through the paths of the Tree of Life, to consecrate talismans and perform elaborate rituals designed to align personal will with cosmic currents. This represented a significant departure from earlier Western magic, which had operated largely within Christian frameworks even when dealing with supposedly demonic forces. The grimoire tradition, exemplified by texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon, assumed the magician worked under divine authority, commanding spirits through the power of God's names and angelic hierarchies. The Golden Dawn and subsequent organizations shifted toward a model where the magician's own developed consciousness was the source of power, where knowledge and trained will, rather than divine permission, granted authority over spiritual forces. The emphasis on individual development over collective salvation aligned these traditions with left-hand path principles, even when practitioners did not explicitly identify as such. The goal was not to merge with the divine through devotion, but to elevate the individual consciousness to divine status through systematic training. This apotheosis, the transformation of human into God, echoed ancient mystery traditions while departing radically from Christian humility before an all-powerful creator. Other figures in Western occultism contributed to this leftward current, each adding distinctive elements. The French occultist Eliphas Levi had earlier in the 19th century synthesized magical practice with political radicalism, suggesting that genuine spiritual development required social transformation and individual sovereignty. His writings influenced generations of subsequent practitioners, including Crowley. The Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, operating in the late 19th century, taught sexual magic and individual spiritual authority before the Golden Dawn fully crystallized its system. Dion Fortune, though often positioned as more moderate than Crowley, also emphasized individual will and the development of personal power through occult training. Her novels and non-fiction work suggested that magic was psychology amplified, that trained consciousness could genuinely affect physical reality, and that the practitioner's own developed faculties, rather than appeals to higher powers, generated magical effects. This psychological approach to occultism would become increasingly dominant in the 20th century, providing a bridge between ancient magical worldviews and modern understanding of consciousness. The spread of these ideas accelerated through published books which made material previously guarded by initiatory orders available to solitary practitioners. Crowley's prolific output, despite his attempts to veil advanced teachings in cryptic language and complicated systems of correspondence, eventually revealed most of his magical curriculum to anyone willing to study carefully. This democratization of esoteric knowledge meant that practices once available only to initiates could be reconstructed and experimented with by anyone with sufficient determination and intelligence. The two world wars disrupted European occult organizations but also spread their ideas globally as members fled persecution and immigrated to new countries. The breakdown of colonial empires accelerated cross-cultural exchange, bringing more accurate information about Eastern practices to Western audiences. By mid-century, sufficient material existed for serious students to construct comprehensive magical systems synthesizing Eastern and Western approaches, Tantric and Thelemic techniques, ancient wisdom, and modern psychology. This synthesis produced what would eventually be recognized as distinctly Western left-hand path traditions, ones that shared the Tantric emphasis on consciousness as primary reality and transgression as spiritual technology, while operating within European magical frameworks and aimed at goals articulated in Western philosophical language. The individual will replace the Hindu concept of Atman or the Buddhist concept of Buddha nature, but functioned similarly as the fundamental reality beyond conditioning. Ritual magic replaced yogic and meditative techniques, but served comparable purposes in restructuring consciousness and accessing non-ordinary states. The ethical framework remained the most challenging aspect to communicate. Crowley's insistence that every person has a true will that must be discovered and enacted could sound dangerously subjective, inviting the criticism that anyone could justify any action by claiming it expressed their will. Yet the system included safeguards, extensive preliminary training designed to develop discernment, the requirement that claimed will be tested against results over time, the understanding that false will produces suffering and conflict, while true will generates expansion and flow. These were not perfect protections against self-deception or manipulation, but they at least acknowledged the danger and attempted to address it. What emerged from these Western developments was a tradition parallel to but distinct from the Eastern sources that had partly inspired it. Where Tantra operated within Hindu or Buddhist cosmologies, Western left-hand path magic functioned in a post-Christian, increasingly secular context. Where Tantric practice required guru transmission and connection to unbroken lineages, Western occultism emphasized individual experimentation and reconstruction of practice from textual sources. Where Eastern traditions aimed ultimately at liberation from rebirth or recognition of emptiness, Western approaches often frankly embraced continued individual existence and the enhancement of personal power as desirable outcomes. These differences reflected broader cultural divergences between societies that valued dissolution of self and those that celebrated individual achievement. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they attracted different temperaments and produced different types of practitioners. The Western path suited those who found meaning in action, transformation, and personal will rather than in acceptance, recognition, and surrender. It offered a spiritual framework for the modern individual seeking to navigate existence without traditional religious support structures, while maintaining serious engagement with consciousness and ultimate questions of meaning. The most explicitly leftward development in Western occultism emerged not from ancient lineages or Victorian magical orders, but from mid-20th century America, where a former carnival organist named LaVey synthesized various influences into something unprecedented. In 1966, LaVey founded the Church of Satan, declaring the beginning of the Age of Satan and positioning his organization as the formalization of a philosophy that had existed underground throughout Western history. His provocative choice of Satan as central symbol would forever link the left-hand path in Western consciousness with the figure Christianity had cast as ultimate evil. Though LaVey's actual teaching bore little resemblance to the demonic worship his critics imagined. LaVey's Satanism was fundamentally atheistic, a philosophical position that used Satan as symbol rather than worshipping him as literal entity. The Satan of LaVey's system represented opposition to arbitrary authority, the carnal rather than spiritual nature of humanity, vital existence rather than promises of afterlife reward, and the ego rather than its dissolution. This was Satan as romantic rebel, the Miltonic figure who declared it better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, transformed into an emblem of individual sovereignty and earthly pleasure against the life-denying ethics LaVey perceived in Christianity. The Satanic Bible, published in 1969, articulated this philosophy with deliberate provocation and surprising pragmatism. LaVey rejected the supernatural claims of all religions, viewing gods and demons alike as human projections, archetypal forces useful for psychological purposes but not literally existing independent entities. His ethics inverted Christian values, declaring selfishness rather than altruism as virtuous, vengeance as more honest than turning the other cheek, gratification rather than abstinence as healthy. Yet this was not simple nihilism or encouragement of harmful behavior, but an attempt to construct an ethical system acknowledging the actual motivations driving human action, rather than imposing impossible ideals that generated only hypocrisy. The Church of Satan attracted those alienated by conventional religion, particularly creative and intellectual individuals who rejected both Christian morality and the flower child idealism of the contemporary counterculture. LaVey offered something darker, more honest about human nature, appealing to those who recognized their own desires for power, pleasure, and recognition rather than self-sacrifice for collective good. His theatrical rituals, conducted in the famous Black House in San Francisco, provided cathartic release and psychological empowerment rather than attempts to summon actual demons or produce supernatural effects. The magical practice taught in LaVey's system operated through what he termed greater magic, ritual chambers, where practitioners could focus will and emotion toward desired outcomes, and lesser magic, the everyday psychological manipulation that achieved goals through understanding human nature. Greater magic employed symbols, dramatic ritual, and heightened emotional states to concentrate the practitioner's desires and broadcast them into the universe. Whether this operated through genuine supernatural mechanisms or simply psychological focusing that produced behavioral changes leading to desired results remained deliberately ambiguous in LaVey's writings. The ritual structure drew on various sources including Golden Dawn ceremonial forms, Catholic Mass structure inverted for dramatic effect, and techniques from LaVey's background in carnival and theatre. The famous Satanic Mass included elements designed to shock: naked women as altars, inverted crosses, recitations proclaiming Satan as representative of earthly values against spiritual abstractions. These theatrical elements served multiple purposes. They created intense emotional states useful for magical work. They functioned as deprogramming from Christian conditioning for participants raised in that tradition, and they generated publicity that spread LaVey's philosophy far beyond what conventional promotion could achieve. The 9 satanic statements that opened the Satanic Bible declared the core values. Satan represents indulgence rather than abstinence, vital existence rather than spiritual pipe dreams, undefiled wisdom rather than hypocritical self-deceit, kindness to those who deserve it rather than love wasted on ingrates, vengeance rather than turning the other cheek, responsibility to the responsible rather than concern for psychic vampires, man, as just another animal rather than spiritual being, all of the so-called sins as leading to physical or mental gratification, and the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. These statements deliberately confronted Christian ethics, positioning Satanism as comprehensive alternative rather than mere rebellion. LaVey argued that Christianity demanded the impossible, requiring humans to act against their fundamental nature, generating guilt and neurosis when they inevitably failed to meet impossible standards. His system proposed accepting human nature as it actually operates, channeling natural drives toward constructive ends rather than attempting impossible transcendence that produced only self-deception and projection of shadow material onto others. The philosophical foundation drew heavily on Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, and social Darwinist thinking that now seems problematic, but reflected broader currents in mid-century thought. LaVey celebrated the strong individual who took what they desired through ability and will, showing contempt for weakness and resentment-based moralities that attempted to bind the powerful through guilt. This aspect of LaVeyan thought has drawn considerable criticism, as it can enable abusive behavior and rationalize exploitation when stripped of the more nuanced elements in LaVey's actual teaching. Yet LaVey also emphasized responsibility and consequences, arguing that genuine Satanists understood cause and effect and took responsibility for their actions rather than blaming external forces. He distinguished between indulgence and compulsion, between healthy satisfaction of desires and self-destructive addiction. The satanic rules of the earth included practical guidelines: do not give opinions unless asked, do not complain about anything unless you can change it, do not harm children, do not kill non-human animals unless attacked or for food, do not make sexual advances unless given the mating signal, acknowledge the power of magic. If you have used it successfully to obtain something, do not take what belongs to another unless it is given freely or as fair exchange. This pragmatic ethics reflected LaVey's recognition that pure selfishness ultimately proved self-defeating, that social existence required certain constraints, that long-term success demanded strategic thinking beyond immediate gratification. The Satanist was meant to be strategic and intelligent rather than impulsively destructive, calculating costs and benefits rather than rebelling blindly against all authority. This made LaVeyan Satanism more conservative than its shocking imagery suggested, essentially libertarian in political orientation, emphasizing individual property rights and personal freedom over collective obligations. The organization fractured in the 1970s when Michael Aquino, a member who had achieved high rank within the Church of Satan, broke away to form the Temple of Set. The split involved both personal conflicts and genuine philosophical differences. Aquino had become convinced through his own magical work that Set, the ancient Egyptian deity, was a real entity rather than simply a psychological symbol. He reported receiving communication from Set parallel to Crowley's reception of the Book of the Law, what he termed the Word of Set, at the summer solstice in 1975. This experience led Aquino to establish a theistic, left-hand path tradition in contrast to LaVey's atheistic symbolism. The Temple of Set maintained the emphasis on individual will and self-deification found in LaVeyan Satanism, but reintroduced actual belief in Set as the dark god who gave humanity consciousness and individuality by setting us apart from the natural order. Set represented isolation and individual existence against dissolution into cosmic unity, the principle of separation and distinctness that allowed for self-awareness. Aquino's philosophical framework drew on ancient Egyptian religion reinterpreted through a left-hand path lens. Set, traditionally associated with chaos, the desert, and opposition to the ordered fertility represented by Osiris, became the liberator who disrupted the cycles of nature to create the possibility of individual immortality. The temple taught that humans possessed a divine spark, what they termed the essence or higher self, that could be cultivated through magical practice to achieve genuine immortality rather than simply reabsorption into cosmic forces after death. This represented a significant departure from both LaVeyan materialism and traditional religious afterlife beliefs. The Temple of Set proposed that consciousness did not automatically continue after death, but could be made immortal through systematic spiritual work. The practitioner must crystallize the higher self through magical practices, philosophical study, and what the temple termed Zepa, an Egyptian word meaning "I have come into being," that described the process of self-creation or self-deification. The temple's curriculum included 6 degrees of initiation, each representing stages in this process of self-becoming. The first degree involved recognition of one's own separateness and sovereignty. Higher degrees required demonstrated magical ability, philosophical understanding, and psychological integration. The 6th degree represented recognition as an immortal magus who had achieved genuine apotheosis. Unlike many initiatory orders where advancement came primarily through time served or political maneuvering, the temple at least aspired to grant degrees based on actual accomplishment in magical work and self-development. Aquino brought intellectual rigor to left-hand path practice that LaVey's more theatrical approach sometimes lacked. His writings explored sophisticated metaphysical questions, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual will and cosmic order, the meaning of immortality, the ethics of power. He attempted to ground left-hand path philosophy in serious scholarship about ancient Egyptian religion, pre-Socratic philosophy, and the Western esoteric tradition, rather than simply recycling rebellious gestures. The temple also grappled more directly with the ethical challenges inherent in left-hand path practice. If individual will is supreme, how does one avoid descent into mere selfishness or sociopathy? Aquino's answer involved distinguishing between the lesser self, driven by conditioned desires, and the higher self, whose will aligns with its genuine nature and cosmic role. The practitioner must develop sufficient self-knowledge to distinguish between these levels, much as Crowley distinguished between true will and false will. The temple's emphasis on Set as real entity rather than symbol created different magical possibilities than LaVeyan Satanism. Practitioners could develop relationships with Set through ritual and meditation, could work with Egyptian magical symbolism as living tradition rather than historical curiosity, could understand their practice as participation in cosmic drama involving actual divine forces rather than purely psychological operations. This theistic approach appealed to those who felt drawn to left-hand path principles, but found atheistic materialism spiritually unsatisfying. Both LaVeyan Satanism and the Temple of Set positioned darkness as essential rather than something to be transcended or overcome. Where right-hand traditions viewed darkness as ignorance to be dispelled by light, these left-hand organizations understood darkness as the hidden depths from which consciousness emerged, the mystery beyond all understanding, the primordial chaos from which order crystallized. Darkness represented the unknown and unknowable, the foundation that made the known possible, deserving reverence rather than fear. This symbolic valorization of darkness reflected psychological sophistication about shadow integration. Both organizations recognized that rejecting aspects of self deemed dark or unacceptable generated neurosis and projection, that genuine wholeness required embracing rather than repressing what consciousness found threatening or disturbing. The Satanic or Setian path involved deliberate exploration of personal darkness, integration of shadow material, transformation of what seemed monstrous into personal power. The public face of both organizations remained controversial, attracting moral panic from Christian conservatives who took satanic imagery literally and assumed these groups practiced criminal activity or sought to corrupt youth. In reality, both organizations explicitly forbade illegal acts and screened members carefully to exclude those with criminal intent or serious psychological instability. The gap between public perception and actual practice remained wide, generating both unwanted attention from authorities and useful notoriety that spread their philosophies through media coverage. The influence of these organizations extended far beyond their relatively small membership. LaVey's Satanic Bible became an underground classic, selling millions of copies to readers who never formally joined the Church of Satan, but absorbed its philosophical framework. The Temple of Set's more academic approach influenced serious students of Western esotericism and provided templates for other theistic left-hand path organizations. Together, they established Satanism and Set worship as legitimate options within the broader landscape of alternative spirituality, no longer confined to Christian imagination or horror fiction, but articulated as coherent philosophical positions with systematic magical practice. The figure of Lucifer presents perhaps the most complex and misunderstood symbol within left-hand path traditions, requiring careful distinction from the Satan of Christian theology, despite their frequent conflation in popular imagination. Where Satan often represents opposition and rebellion, Lucifer embodies illumination and the bringing of forbidden knowledge to humanity. The name itself derives from Latin roots meaning light-bearer or morning star, originally referring to the planet Venus in its appearance before dawn. This celestial association carried profound symbolic weight, linking Lucifer to the transition between darkness and light, to the herald of coming illumination, to the boundary between night and day. The transformation of Lucifer from neutral astronomical designation to fallen angel occurred through complex textual interpretations spanning centuries. The prophet Isaiah's taunt against a fallen Babylonian king, using the phrase morning star to mock his descent from power, was later read by Christian interpreters as referring to Satan's rebellion and expulsion from heaven. This conflation gained authority through centuries of theological elaboration, eventually producing the familiar narrative of the prideful angel who refused submission to God and was cast into hell for his defiance, taking a third of heaven's angels with him in rebellion. Left-hand path traditions have reclaimed this figure, stripping away the moralistic overlay to reveal what they view as the original revolutionary impulse. In Luciferian interpretation, the rebellion was not sin but necessary assertion of individual will against tyrannical authority. Lucifer becomes the first individualist, the prototype of conscious beings who refuse to surrender autonomy even to their creator. His fall represents not punishment for wickedness but the inevitable consequence of choosing authentic selfhood over comfortable obedience, a choice that Luciferians celebrate rather than condemn. This reading finds support in Gnostic traditions that flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era, offering radically different interpretations of creation narratives than Orthodox Christianity would eventually impose. The Gnostics viewed the material world not as good creation of a benevolent deity, but as prison constructed by a false god, a demiurge who claimed to be the supreme creator while actually being ignorant of higher spiritual realities. This entity, sometimes identified with the God of the Hebrew Bible, ruled over the material realm through archons, lesser powers that kept humanity trapped in ignorance of their divine origins. Within certain Gnostic texts, the serpent in Eden appears not as tempter leading humanity into sin, but as liberator bringing saving knowledge. The fruit of the tree represented gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of divine reality beyond the false god's deceptions. By encouraging humanity to eat, the serpent offered escape from the prison of ignorance, awakening Adam and Eve to their true nature as sparks of divine light trapped in matter. The demiurge's angry response, expelling them from Eden and cursing them with mortality and suffering, revealed his tyrannical nature and confirmed that the serpent had acted as ally rather than enemy of humanity. These Gnostic narratives resonate deeply with left-hand path practitioners who view conventional religion as system of control rather than path to genuine liberation. The story of a false god demanding obedience, punishing those who seek knowledge, and claiming exclusive authority while being ignorant of higher truth perfectly captures what Luciferians perceive in mainstream religious institutions. The serpent as wisdom bringer, willing to oppose divine authority for the sake of human awakening, provides a mythic template for the left-hand path itself. The connection to Prometheus strengthens this symbolic framework, demonstrating that the forbidden knowledge theme extends beyond Judeo-Christian tradition into Greek mythology. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity despite Zeus's prohibition. This gift represented not just literal flame, but the entire complex of civilization, technology, arts, science, all the knowledge that elevated humans above mere survival. Zeus punished Prometheus brutally, chaining him to a rock where an eagle ate his liver daily, the organ regenerating each night to renew the torment eternally. Yet Prometheus endured this punishment willingly, having foreseen the consequences of his theft, but choosing to benefit humanity regardless of personal cost. This selfless criminality, this violation of divine law for the sake of human advancement, embodies the Luciferian principle perfectly. Both Prometheus and Lucifer defied cosmic authority to bring enlightenment. Both suffered terrible punishment for their gifts, and both became symbols of the noble rebel who places knowledge and freedom above obedience and security. Similar themes appear across cultures in myths of trickster figures and culture heroes who steal or trick the gods into releasing benefits meant to remain in divine hands. The Polynesian Maui snared the sun to lengthen the day, stole fire, and pulled islands from the sea, often through clever deception of higher powers. The Native American coyote and raven figures brought light and fire to humanity through trickery, violated taboos, and generally disrupted cosmic order for human benefit. These mythic patterns suggest deep psychological structures around the relationship between authority and knowledge, between comfort and growth, between submission and individuation. Luciferian practice in contemporary left-hand path traditions draws on these mythic resonances while developing specific techniques and philosophical frameworks. Unlike LaVeyan Satanism's atheistic symbolism or the Temple of Set's theistic approach to an ancient Egyptian deity, Luciferianism occupies a middle ground. Some practitioners view Lucifer as literal entity, a conscious intelligence that can be contacted through ritual and meditation. Others treat Lucifer as archetypal force within human consciousness, the urge toward enlightenment and self-determination that can be activated and amplified through magical work. The core Luciferian practices emphasize illumination, the systematic expansion of consciousness through study, meditation, and magical experimentation. Where Satanism might focus on earthly power and pleasure, and Setianism on self-deification and immortality, Luciferianism prioritizes knowledge acquisition and intellectual development. The practitioner seeks to become like Lucifer, a bearer of light who has achieved understanding beyond conventional limitations, who has eaten fully from the tree of knowledge regardless of divine prohibitions. This emphasis on knowledge distinguishes Luciferian practice from simple rebellion or antinomianism. The point is not merely to violate rules, but to understand why rules exist, to perceive the structures of control that bind human consciousness, and to systematically free oneself through increasing awareness. The Luciferian studies not just occult philosophy, but science, psychology, comparative religion, anything that expands understanding of how reality operates and consciousness functions within it. Ritual practice in Luciferian traditions often involves invocations of Lucifer as illuminating presence, meditation on the morning star, work with light symbolism despite the apparently dark nature of left-hand path practice. This embrace of light imagery might seem contradictory given the emphasis on darkness in other left-hand path currents, but it reflects the Luciferian understanding that true enlightenment requires integrating both light and dark, that wisdom comes from encompassing all aspects of existence rather than identifying exclusively with either pole. The ethics of Luciferian practice grapple with the implications of forbidden knowledge and individual sovereignty. If no external authority can legitimately command obedience, if each individual must discover their own path through direct experience, how does one avoid descent into chaos or harmful behavior? The Luciferian answer emphasizes developed consciousness and expanded awareness as guides. The more one genuinely understands, the more clearly one perceives the consequences of actions, and genuine wisdom naturally leads toward choices that enhance life and consciousness, rather than diminishing them. This places tremendous responsibility on the individual practitioner who cannot appeal to divine commandments or traditional morality when facing ethical dilemmas. The Luciferian must develop their own ethical sense through experience, study, and careful consideration of consequences. This demanding approach suits those temperamentally inclined toward philosophical inquiry and intellectual rigor, but it carries obvious dangers for those who might use the language of Luciferian freedom to rationalize destructive impulses. The figure of the light-bearer also connects to ancient mystery traditions that promised initiates knowledge hidden from the masses. The Eleusinian mysteries, Orphic traditions, Mithraic initiations, and various other secret teaching lineages offered progressive revelation of esoteric truths to those who proved themselves worthy through preliminary trials and dedication. These mystery schools understood that certain knowledge proved dangerous without proper preparation, that illumination achieved too quickly could destabilize consciousness, that sacred wisdom required protected transmission from teacher to qualified student. Modern Luciferian organizations attempt to recreate this initiatory structure, offering degrees or grades that mark progression in understanding and ability. The Greater Church of Lucifer, the Assembly of Lightbearers, and various other groups provide frameworks for systematic study and practice, though with varying degrees of rigor and authenticity. The challenge remains distinguishing between genuine mystery schools that demand real transformation and mere social organizations using initiatory language without substance. The connection between Luciferian thought and Western philosophy runs deeper than simple influence or parallel development. Enlightenment era emphasis on reason over faith, individual rights over divine right of kings, scientific inquiry over revealed doctrine, all these represented Luciferian principles in secular form. The philosophers who championed human potential against religious authority, who argued that knowledge should be freely available rather than guarded by priestly castes, who asserted the right to question all authority, including God himself, enacted Luciferian rebellion, whether they recognized it or not. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead and his exhortation to become who you are, Sartre's insistence on radical freedom and the responsibility it entails, Camus' defiant rebel who says no to cosmic absurdity. These philosophical positions articulate Luciferian themes for modern secular audiences. They share the fundamental premise that humans must create their own meaning and values rather than receiving them from external authorities, divine or otherwise. The artistic tradition also carries Luciferian currents, particularly in Romantic and Gothic literature that portrayed Satan or Lucifer as heroic rebel rather than absolute evil. Milton's Paradise Lost, despite its author's Christian intentions, created such a compelling portrait of Satan that readers across centuries have found him more sympathetic than the distant authoritarian god. Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell explicitly celebrated diabolical energy and creative rebellion against restrictive morality. Byron's Cain presented the first murderer as tragic hero, driven by noble desire for knowledge. These artistic works shaped cultural consciousness in ways that made explicitly Luciferian spirituality conceivable. They provided mythic templates and symbolic vocabularies that later occultists could draw upon when articulating their practices. The Romantic celebration of individual genius, the Gothic fascination with transgression and forbidden knowledge, the general rebellion against Enlightenment rationality and Christian morality all created cultural space where leftward spiritual paths could emerge and develop. Contemporary Luciferianism continues evolving, incorporating insights from psychology, neuroscience, and other fields that illuminate consciousness and human potential. The basic framework remains consistent. Consciousness is primary, knowledge is liberation, individual sovereignty must be defended against all attempts at control, and the path to genuine wisdom requires confronting rather than avoiding what conventional morality labels as dark or forbidden. These principles attract seekers who find mainstream religion infantilizing, who refuse to surrender intellectual autonomy, and who trust their own developed consciousness more than external authorities regardless of their claimed divine sanction. The trajectory from ancient Tantra through Western ceremonial magic and satanic philosophy culminated in perhaps the most radical development within left-hand path thought, the emergence of chaos magic in late 20th century Britain. This approach stripped away the elaborate cosmologies and mythic frameworks that previous traditions had employed, reducing magical practice to its bare operational essence. The chaos magicians argued that belief itself was the active ingredient in magical work, that the specific symbols, deities, or theoretical models mattered less than the intensity of conviction the practitioner could generate. This insight fundamentally altered the landscape of Western occultism, introducing a pragmatic, results-oriented approach that treated all previous systems as useful fictions rather than revealed truths. The origins of chaos magic trace back to the work of Austin Osman Spare, an English artist and occultist whose life spanned from 1886 to 1956. Spare had briefly associated with Aleister Crowley but found the elaborate ceremonial structures of Thelema unnecessarily complex. He developed his own system centered on what he called sigil magic, a technique for programming desire directly into the subconscious mind. The method was elegantly simple. The practitioner wrote out a statement of intention, eliminated repeated letters, arranged the remaining letters into an abstract symbol or sigil, charged this sigil through intense concentration during moments of vacuity or absence of thought, then deliberately forgot both the sigil and the original intention to prevent conscious interference with the magical process. This technique represented a significant departure from traditional ceremonial magic with its elaborate rituals, proper timing according to astrological correspondences, invocations of specific entities, and complex symbolic systems. Spare's approach suggested that consciousness itself, when properly focused and directed, could affect reality without requiring divine intermediaries or cosmic forces. The sigil functioned as a delivery mechanism for will, a way to bypass the conscious mind's doubts and resistance to implant intention directly into the depths where, Spare believed, consciousness interfaced with the underlying creative matrix of reality itself. Spare's theoretical framework drew on both his study of occultism and his artist's intuitive understanding of symbolism and unconscious process. He proposed that ordinary consciousness operates within narrow constraints, filtering out most of reality to maintain stable sense of self and world. Magical states of consciousness broke through these filters, accessing what he termed the neither-neither or primordial creative state prior to the distinction between self and other. In these states, desire could impress itself directly on the plastic substrate of reality, manifesting as physical results when the practitioner returned to ordinary consciousness. The sexual dimension of Spare's work paralleled Tantric and Thelemic practices, but with characteristic simplicity and directness. He recognized that sexual arousal, and particularly orgasm, produced moments of consciousness unlike ordinary waking states, moments when the usual mental chatter ceased and awareness became pure sensation. These moments of vacuity provided ideal conditions for charging sigils, for impressing intention into consciousness when defensive structures temporarily dissolved. Spare's death posture techniques combined exhausting physical positions with sexual arousal to produce altered states useful for magical work. His ideas remained largely obscure during his lifetime, circulating primarily through small press publications and among the few occultists aware of his work. The mainstream occult community, dominated by the ceremonial magic traditions of the Golden Dawn and its offshoots, largely ignored or dismissed Spare's stripped-down approach. He spent his later years in poverty, creating extraordinary art, largely unrecognized by either the art world or occult communities, dying in relative obscurity without establishing a formal school or organization to continue his methods. The rediscovery and development of Spare's techniques occurred in the 1970s when British occultists Ray Sherwin and Peter Carroll encountered his work and recognized its revolutionary potential. They founded the Illuminates of Thanateros, an organization dedicated to exploring chaos magic principles through practical experimentation. Their approach combined Spare's sigil techniques with insights from various other sources, Tibetan Buddhist meditation practices, Western ceremonial magic, stripped of its mystical overlay, quantum physics metaphors, information theory, anything that seemed useful regardless of its traditional context or theoretical framework. The term chaos referenced both the primordial creative state from which order emerges and the group's rejection of dogmatic systems. Chaos magicians embraced paradox, deliberately holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously, treating reality as more fluid and responsive to consciousness than conventional materialism suggested, while simultaneously maintaining skepticism about any ultimate explanation. This both and rather than either or approach allowed practitioners to work effectively with whatever model produced results without becoming trapped in belief systems that limited experimentation. The concept of paradigm shifting became central to chaos magic practice. A paradigm represented a complete worldview or reality tunnel, a coherent set of assumptions about how reality operates. Traditional magicians worked within single paradigms. Ceremonial magicians believed in Kabbalistic correspondences and angelic hierarchies. Wiccans believed in goddess and god forces. Satanists believed in either symbolic or theistic interpretations of Satan. Chaos magicians learned to shift between paradigms like changing clothes, adopting whatever belief system served their current magical intention, then setting it aside when finished. This radical flexibility required extraordinary mental discipline, as the practitioner had to genuinely believe in each paradigm while using it, not merely pretending or going through motions. The chaos magician learned to convince themselves temporarily of worldviews they knew intellectually to be constructs, to generate authentic emotional investment in symbols and entities they recognized as useful fictions. This practice cultivated what Peter Carroll termed meta-belief, a level of consciousness that could observe and orchestrate belief itself, rather than being unconsciously identified with any particular belief system. The technique of gnosis, borrowed and modified from Gnostic traditions, provided methods for entering the altered states where magic actually occurred. Chaos magic distinguished between inhibitory gnosis and excitatory gnosis, two complementary approaches to consciousness alteration. Inhibitory gnosis involved shutting down normal mental activity through meditation, sensory deprivation, exhaustion, or other techniques that emptied consciousness. Excitatory gnosis used overstimulation through intense physical activity, dancing, chanting, sexual arousal, sensory overload, or other methods that overwhelmed normal consciousness. Both approaches aimed to reach the liminal state where will could affect reality, where desire met the creative matrix underlying manifestation. Sigil work remained the core technique, though chaos magicians expanded and modified Spare's original methods. Some practitioners created elaborate systems for sigil construction, while others simplified even further, scrawling intentions hastily without concern for aesthetic elegance. The key remained the psychological process. Formulate clear intention, create symbol representing that intention, charge symbol in altered state, forget entirely to prevent conscious interference with manifestation. Results were tracked and analyzed, with practitioners developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of what worked and what did not through systematic experimentation. The pragmatic orientation of chaos magic represented its most significant contribution to left-hand path thought. Previous traditions had required belief in elaborate metaphysical systems, acceptance of specific cosmologies or divine hierarchies, adherence to particular ethical frameworks. Chaos magic required only results. If a technique produced desired outcomes reliably, it was valid regardless of what theory purported to explain it. If a technique failed despite perfect theoretical justification, it was discarded. This ruthless empiricism freed practitioners from attachment to any single explanation while encouraging constant innovation and refinement. The death of dogma that chaos magic proclaimed extended beyond magical technique to ethics and meaning-making, Just as belief systems became tools rather than truths, moral frameworks became strategies rather than absolute laws. The chaos magician constructed personal ethics based on what facilitated magical development and produced desired life conditions rather than appealing to divine commandments or traditional values. This demanded mature judgment and rigorous self-honesty, as the temptation to rationalize harmful behavior under cover of pragmatic ethics remained ever present. Chaos magic's influence spread rapidly through occult communities during the 1980s and 1990s, accelerated by publications like Carroll's Libernal and Psychonaut, and various journals dedicated to practical experimentation. The Internet era amplified this spread exponentially, with forums and websites allowing practitioners worldwide to share techniques, results, and innovations. The democratization of magical knowledge that had begun with published grimoires and accelerated through mass-market paperbacks reached new heights when anyone could access comprehensive magical training materials with simple web searches. This accessibility created both opportunities and problems. Serious practitioners could construct sophisticated magical practices drawing on multiple traditions, could connect with others pursuing similar research regardless of geographic distance, could publish experimental results, and receive immediate feedback. But the same openness meant anyone could claim expertise without demonstrating actual ability, could spread misinformation that confused beginners, could reduce profound practices to superficial techniques stripped of context and safety protocols. The chaos magic emphasis on personal experimentation and rejection of authority made quality control nearly impossible. Traditional initiatory orders, whatever their faults, at least attempted to ensure students developed genuine understanding and ability before advancing. Chaos magic's insistence that each practitioner must discover what works through trial and error meant many pursued dead ends, accumulated bad habits, or settled for minimal results while believing they had mastered the art. The system's strength, its flexibility and freedom from dogma, also represented its weakness when practitioners lacked the discipline to maintain rigorous standards for their own work. The relationship between chaos magic and left-hand path philosophy remained complex. Chaos magic itself claimed no particular metaphysical position, no stance on whether consciousness should be dissolved or crystallized, no commitment to either right or left-hand orientations. Yet its emphasis on individual sovereignty, rejection of external authority, pragmatic ethics, and will, as primary creative force, aligned naturally with leftward principles. Most serious chaos magicians found themselves drawn toward left-hand path perspectives even when they had not initially identified with that tradition. The postmodern philosophical currents that emerged contemporaneously with chaos magic reinforced its core insights. Deconstructionist thought's emphasis on the constructed nature of meaning, the absence of stable foundations, the play of signifiers without fixed signifieds. All this paralleled the chaos magic understanding of belief as tool rather than truth. The postmodern recognition that no single narrative could encompass reality, that multiple contradictory interpretations could coexist validly, that power relations shaped what counted as knowledge. These themes found magical expression in paradigm shifting and meta-belief. Contemporary chaos magic has evolved beyond its early formulations, incorporating insights from cognitive science, complexity theory, memetics, and other fields that illuminate how consciousness operates and affects behavior. Practitioners explore the interface between neurological processes and magical states, investigating how specific practices alter brain chemistry and neural firing patterns. The magical universe of discourse expands to include scientific vocabularies not as replacement for traditional symbolic systems, but as additional tools in the pragmatic magician's arsenal. The legacy of chaos magic extends throughout contemporary occultism, influencing even traditions that explicitly reject its philosophy. The emphasis on practical results, the willingness to experiment with techniques from any source, the the recognition that belief itself functions as magical technology. These insights have become so widespread that their origin in chaos magic is often forgotten. The landscape of Western occultism in the 21st century reflects chaos magic's impact whether individual practitioners acknowledge the debt or not, as flexibility and pragmatism increasingly replace the rigid systematization that characterized earlier approaches. The psychological dimensions of left-hand path practice find their most sophisticated articulation through engagement with depth psychology, particularly the analytical framework developed by Carl Jung. While Jung himself remained firmly rooted in Christian mysticism and suspicious of overtly occult practices, his theories of the shadow, individuation, and the self provided conceptual tools that left-hand path practitioners recognized as describing their own work in psychological rather than mythological language. The convergence between Jungian psychology and leftward spirituality reveals how ancient practices of confronting the forbidden and integrating darkness operate at the level of psyche, transforming consciousness through systematic engagement with rejected aspects of self. Jung's concept of the shadow encompasses everything an individual has denied, repressed, or failed to recognize within themselves. These elements do not disappear simply because consciousness refuses to acknowledge them, but instead operate autonomously from the unconscious, generating compulsions, projections, and sabotaging behaviors the person cannot consciously control. The shadow contains not only negative traits but also positive potentials that were rejected because they conflicted with the persona, the social mask constructed to gain acceptance and navigate collective life. Genius suppressed to avoid standing out, authentic desires denied to meet parental expectations, power rejected to maintain false humility. All these lodge in shadow alongside the genuinely destructive impulses. Traditional religious approaches typically attempt to manage shadow material through repression, reinforced by moral injunctions and promises of divine punishment. The aspirant identifies with an idealized self-image, maintaining it through constant vigilance against thoughts and feelings that contradict this ideal. This generates what Jung called the persona inflation, where the individual becomes identified with their social role or spiritual attainment while remaining unconscious of the shadow aspects that continue operating beneath surface awareness. The result is precisely the religious hypocrisy that Nietzsche and others criticized. The righteous preacher discovered in scandal, the spiritual teacher revealed as abusive, the moral crusader exposed as secret transgressor. The left-hand path approach inverts this strategy entirely. Rather than repressing shadow material, the practitioner deliberately seeks it out, brings it to consciousness, and integrates it into their wholeness. This does not mean acting out every destructive impulse or indulging every taboo desire, but rather acknowledging these aspects of self without moral judgment, understanding their origins, and consciously deciding how to engage with them. The shadow, once recognized and accepted, loses its autonomous power over behavior, while its energy becomes available for conscious use. The process of shadow integration parallels what mystical traditions have termed the dark night of the soul, though with significantly different theological interpretations. In Christian mysticism, the dark night represents the soul's purification through abandonment by God, a stripping away of false consolations and attachments that prepares consciousness for divine union. The mystic experiences desolation, emptiness, spiritual dryness, feeling utterly cut off from the divine presence they previously enjoyed. This purgative stage, however painful, was understood as necessary preparation for genuine mystical attainment. The left-hand path practitioner experiences similar phenomenology, but interprets it through different frameworks. The dark night becomes confrontation with the constructed nature of identity itself. The recognition that the self one has believed oneself to be is merely a provisional organization of psychological material rather than a fixed essence. This realization provokes existential crisis, as the certainties that previously structured experience dissolve without guarantee that anything will replace them. The practitioner must continue functioning while the foundations of selfhood reveal themselves as contingent constructions, maintaining presence while ego structures temporarily collapse. This passage through psychological death was recognized in alchemical traditions as the nigredo, the blackening phase where base matter dissolves into prima materia before it can be reconfigured into gold. The alchemical texts described operations like putrefaction, mortification, and calcination, processes that destroyed existing forms to liberate the essence trapped within them. Western occultists recognize these descriptions as veiled instructions for psychological transformation, recipes for conscious work with shadow material disguised as laboratory procedures. The left-hand path understanding of alchemical transformation differs from both exoteric chemistry and right-hand mystical interpretations. The goal is not to purify consciousness by removing its dark elements, but to transmute the entire psyche by integrating everything into conscious awareness. Lead transforms to gold not by becoming something other than lead, but by having its essential nature recognized and actualized. Similarly, shadow material does not need to be eliminated, but rather understood and incorporated, its energy redirected from unconscious sabotage toward conscious intention. This emphasis on integration rather than transcendence extends to the ego itself, that structure of consciousness that most spiritual traditions identify as the primary obstacle to enlightenment. Buddhism teaches anatman, no self, arguing that the sense of stable personal identity is illusion to be seen through. Hindu Vedanta describes the ego as false identification with body and mind that obscures recognition of the eternal Atman. Christian mysticism calls for death of the self that Christ may live through the emptied vessel. Across traditions, the message remains consistent. The ego must be dissolved, transcended, or destroyed for spiritual realization to occur. The left-hand path categorically rejects this formulation. The ego is not enemy but essential structure, not obstacle but vehicle, not illusion, but the only genuine reality directly accessible to experience. Rather than seeking to dissolve ego boundaries and merge with cosmic unity, the practitioner works to strengthen, refine, and ultimately immortalize the individuated consciousness. This represents perhaps the most fundamental distinction between right and left-hand approaches, the point where their trajectories diverge completely toward opposite horizon. The psychological sophistication of this position becomes clear when one distinguishes between healthy ego strength and defensive ego inflation. A healthy ego maintains stable sense of identity while remaining flexible, can acknowledge limitation without fragmentation, integrates new experience without losing coherence. An inflated ego defends desperately against threats to its constructed self-image, projects disowned material onto others, and rigidifies into brittle structures that crack under pressure. Much of what spiritual traditions criticize as ego is actually this defensive inflation, the false self that Jung called the persona rather than genuine ego strength. The left-hand path cultivates ego development in the psychological sense, while simultaneously working to see through ego identifications in the Buddhist sense. This paradoxical stance requires maintaining awareness at multiple levels simultaneously, recognizing the constructed nature of identity while still valuing and developing one's particular construction, seeing through the illusion of separate self while still honoring and strengthening individual consciousness. This both and rather than either or approach demands extraordinary cognitive flexibility and tolerance for paradox. The goal of this psychological work is apotheosis, the elevation of individual consciousness to divine status. This concept, which sounds like megalomaniacal delusion from outside the left-hand path perspective, operates with specific technical meaning within these traditions. Apotheosis does not mean claiming omnipotence or supernatural abilities, though developed consciousness may indeed manifest capacities that appear magical from ordinary perspective. Rather, it means achieving conscious immortality through crystallization of the higher self, becoming a permanent center of awareness that persists beyond biological death. This understanding draws on ancient traditions while reformulating them in psychological language. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, suggested correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, implying that individual consciousness recapitulates cosmic structure. If divinity is characterized by eternal existence, self-awareness, and creative will, then consciousness that achieves these qualities functionally becomes divine, regardless of metaphysical status relative to hypothetical created deities. The practitioner who develops stable self-awareness that continues beyond death, who exercises conscious creative will rather than merely reacting to circumstances, who participates knowingly in the ongoing generation of reality, such a being has achieved apotheosis in the operative sense that matters for practice. The techniques for actualizing this transformation combine psychological work with the magical practices discussed in earlier sections. Shadow integration provides the foundation, as unrecognized unconscious material would sabotage any attempt at conscious immortality. The practitioner must become aware of the entirety of their psychological contents, not to eliminate darkness, but to bring it under conscious recognition and integration. This requires unflinching self-honesty, willingness to acknowledge aspects of self that social conditioning taught must be rejected, courage to embrace what collective morality labels as evil or forbidden. Meditation practices adapted from Eastern traditions support this work, though with different aims than in their original contexts. Where the Buddhist meditator cultivates awareness to recognize the empty nature of all phenomena, including self, the left-hand path practitioner uses similar techniques to observe psychological process, while maintaining rather than dissolving the observing consciousness. Mindfulness becomes a tool for understanding the mechanics of identity construction rather than for seeing through identity itself. The stable witness cultivated through meditation practice becomes the core of the immortalized consciousness. Dream work provides another avenue for engaging unconscious material and developing the subtle bodies that might persist beyond physical death. Lucid dreaming, where the practitioner becomes conscious within the dream state while maintaining the dream, trains awareness to function independent of physical sensation. The developed ability to navigate dream realms consciously translates to potential navigation of the bardos, or intermediate states that various traditions describe as occurring between death and rebirth. Whether these bardos have objective existence or represent psychological states becomes irrelevant if one has developed capacity to maintain conscious awareness through radical state changes. The integration of magical and psychological frameworks creates a comprehensive system for consciousness development that surpasses either approach alone. Psychological work without magical practice can produce genuine integration and mental health, but may plateau at conventional human capacity. Magical practice without psychological foundation often produces inflation, dissociation, or empty ritual that generates theatrical effects without genuine transformation. The combination allows for systematic development of capacities beyond normal human function while maintaining psychological stability and genuine self-knowledge. The ethical dimensions of this work grow more complex as consciousness develops. Conventional morality based on obedience to external authority obviously cannot serve as guide for the practitioner who has transcended that framework, but neither can simple selfishness or immediate gratification, which operate from the level of undeveloped ego rather than integrated higher self. The ethics that emerge from genuine apotheosis are neither conventional nor sociopathic, but reflect the developed wisdom of consciousness that has integrated shadow, transcended false identifications, and achieved stable self-awareness. These ethics resemble what developmental psychology calls post-conventional morality, characterized by universal principles discovered through experience and reflection, rather than cultural transmission. The practitioner, who has genuinely integrated shadow and achieved stable consciousness, naturally operates from compassion and wisdom, not because rules demand it, but because developed awareness recognizes the consequences of action and the interconnection between apparently separate beings. This morality proves more reliable than conventional ethics precisely because it stems from direct perception rather than blind obedience. The dark night, the nigredo, the descent into shadow, all these represent necessary passages rather than unfortunate obstacles to be minimized. The left-hand path recognizes that genuine transformation requires dismantling existing structures of self, confronting everything consciousness has rejected or denied, allowing temporary dissolution of identity in service of more comprehensive reorganization. This death before death, this voluntary embrace of psychological crisis, this deliberate exploration of personal darkness separates serious practitioners from those seeking only power or rebellion without true transformation. The work continues throughout life as new layers of unconscious material emerge and require integration, as consciousness discovers ever subtler identifications to see through while maintaining its essential continuity. Apotheosis is not single dramatic event but ongoing process of self-creation and self-transcendence, the alchemical work that continues until biological death, and if the tradition's claims hold true, beyond that final threshold into whatever realms consciousness inhabits when freed from physical constraint. The question of ethics haunts left-hand path traditions with particular intensity precisely because these systems reject the external moral authorities that make ethical life seem straightforward for conventional believers. When divine commandments no longer bind, when traditional values reveal themselves as cultural constructions, when individual will become supreme, what prevents descent into harmful solipsism or predatory behavior dressed in philosophical language? This challenge cannot be dismissed as mere outside criticism from those who misunderstand the path, for it represents genuine danger that every serious practitioner must confront honestly. The history of occultism contains too many cautionary tales of individuals who used leftward philosophy to rationalize cruelty, exploitation, and self-destruction. Nietzsche's proclamation that we must go beyond good and evil provides both illumination and potential confusion for left-hand path ethics. His actual meaning has been consistently misunderstood, reduced to simple moral relativism or nihilistic rejection of all values. What Nietzsche actually advocated was transcendence of conventional morality based on resentment and life denial, the slave morality he saw dominating Western civilization through Christianity's influence. He called for new values created by strong individuals who embraced life in its totality, who said yes to existence, including its suffering and struggle, who took responsibility for creating meaning rather than discovering it in divine revelation. This Nietzschean project aligns closely with left-hand path aims while highlighting the ethical complexity involved. The practitioner who moves beyond conventional good and evil does not thereby escape ethical considerations, but rather assumes far greater responsibility for moral choices. Without divine commandments to follow, each decision requires careful consideration of consequences, honest assessment of motivations, and willingness to accept full responsibility for outcomes. This proves far more demanding than simple obedience to external rules, which is precisely why most people never attempt it. The distinction between antinomianism and nihilism becomes crucial here. Antinomianism, from Greek roots meaning against law, describes opposition to moral law as absolute or externally imposed. The antinomian recognizes conventional morality as constructed rather than cosmic, refuses submission to moral authorities, and claims the right to determine their own ethical framework. This need not lead to rejection of all ethics, but rather to personalized moral codes based on direct experience and developed wisdom. The antinomian may well conclude that certain behaviors remain harmful, and should be avoided, but this conclusion comes from understanding rather than obedience. Nihilism, by contrast, denies that any values or meanings exist objectively, often concluding that all actions are equally meaningless and ethical distinctions are arbitrary preferences without foundation. This philosophical position can lead to genuine moral paralysis or serve as rationalization for destructive behavior, since if nothing matters ultimately, why not pursue immediate gratification regardless of consequences? The nihilist mistakes the absence of cosmic moral law for the absence of any basis for ethics, failing to recognize that values can be created and sustained by conscious beings even without divine sanction. The left-hand path practitioner must navigate carefully between these positions, rejecting external moral authority without falling into nihilistic denial of all values. This requires developing what might be termed sovereign ethics, moral frameworks created by the individual through experience and reflection, rather than received from tradition or revelation. Such ethics are not arbitrary because they arise from genuine understanding of how actions affect consciousness, relationships, and the broader systems within which one operates. They are not absolute because they remain open to revision as understanding deepens and circumstances change. The principle of personal responsibility stands at the center of any viable left-hand path ethics. If the practitioner claims sovereignty over their own consciousness and decisions, they must accept complete responsibility for the consequences of their actions. This eliminates the comforting possibility of blaming God, society, circumstances, or other external factors for one's failures or harmful choices. The sovereign individual cannot claim victim status, cannot appeal to superior orders, cannot hide behind collective decisions. Every action stems from personal will and generates consequences the practitioner must own entirely. This radical responsibility extends to recognizing that actions affect others who have not consented to participate in one's experiments with consciousness or will. The left-hand path emphasis on individual sovereignty logically implies respecting the sovereignty of other conscious beings, even when one disagrees with how they exercise that sovereignty. This sets limits on acceptable behavior that prevent leftward philosophy from collapsing into simple might makes right predation. The practitioner who violates another's autonomy through force or deception contradicts the very principle of individual will they claim to uphold. The challenge intensifies when considering that different practitioners may develop genuinely incompatible ethical frameworks through their individual work. What one person concludes is necessary and appropriate, another might judge harmful and unacceptable. Without appeal to external authority to adjudicate these conflicts, how do practitioners with divergent ethics coexist? The pragmatic answer involves recognizing that social existence requires negotiated agreements, that sustainable sovereignty necessitates respecting boundaries, even when one could theoretically violate them, that long-term flourishing depends on maintaining relationships and reputation within communities of practice. The psychological risks of left-hand path work compound these ethical challenges. Practices that deliberately confront shadow material, that transgress conventional boundaries, that cultivate states of consciousness outside ordinary experience, all these can destabilize psyche if undertaken without proper foundation or guidance. The practitioner may experience what psychiatry would diagnose as dissociative episodes, psychotic breaks, or manic states. Distinguishing between genuine spiritual crisis that leads to growth and psychological breakdown that requires intervention becomes critically important, but often difficult in the moment. Inflation represents one of the most common pitfalls occurring when the ego identifies with archetypal or divine energies encountered during magical work. The practitioner begins believing they have achieved complete mastery, that they possess extraordinary powers, that ordinary rules and limitations no longer apply to them. This inflated state feels profoundly convincing from inside, often accompanied by genuine alterations in consciousness and capacity that seem to confirm the grandiose self-assessment. Yet it represents a form of possession by archetypal forces rather than genuine integration, a trap that has destroyed many promising practitioners. The antidote to inflation requires maintaining connection to ordinary reality and relationships with people who will honestly reflect when one's behavior becomes erratic or grandiose. Isolation amplifies the risk as the practitioner loses external reference points that might challenge inflated self-perception. This creates tension with the left-hand path emphasis on individual sovereignty and suspicion of external authority, since the inflated ego will naturally resist feedback that threatens its exalted self-image. Navigating this tension demands mature discrimination, the capacity to remain open to input without surrendering autonomy. Shadow possession presents the opposite danger, where the practitioner becomes identified with dark material encountered during integration work. Instead of recognizing shadow contents as partial aspects requiring integration, consciousness collapses into identification with them, leading to acting out of destructive impulses under the belief this represents authentic expression of true self. The person who discovers rage during shadow work and concludes they are fundamentally angry, who encounters sexual desires and believes they must act on every impulse, who finds cruelty and decides this reveals their essential nature. All these represent failures of integration where discovered material overwhelms rather than informs consciousness. The difference between integration and identification marks the boundary between psychological growth and destructive acting out. Integration means acknowledging shadow material, understanding its origins and purposes, consciously deciding how to relate to it while maintaining broader perspective. Identification means collapsing into shadow contents, losing discriminating awareness, believing that particular psychological material defines the totality of self. The integrated practitioner can access rage when appropriate, while not being controlled by it, can acknowledge sexual desires while choosing consciously whether and how to express them, can recognize capacity for cruelty without needing to actualize it. Drug use presents particular risks within left-hand path contexts, as substances that alter consciousness can seem to facilitate magical work or accelerate spiritual development. Some traditions explicitly incorporate psychoactive substances in ritual contexts, viewing them as tools for accessing non-ordinary states. Yet the boundary between sacramental use and addiction proves remarkably permeable, and the substances themselves care nothing for the spiritual intentions of the user. The practitioner who begins using substances as tools may find themselves serving the substances instead, with consumption gradually replacing genuine practice. The sexual practices present in various left-hand path traditions carry their own distinct risks. Working with sexual energy for magical purposes requires extraordinary discipline and self-awareness, distinguishing between genuine spiritual practice and rationalized indulgence. The history of Western occultism contains too many examples of teachers who used sexual magic as pretext for exploitation, of organizations that devolved into sex cults where spiritual language masked simple predation. This does not invalidate legitimate sexual practices, but it does demand extreme caution and rigorous ethical consideration. The psychological attraction of left-hand path philosophies for certain personality types creates additional concern. Those with narcissistic tendencies may gravitate toward teachings emphasizing individual sovereignty and self-deification, finding philosophical justification for pre-existing self-absorption. Antisocial personalities may adopt leftward language to rationalize lack of empathy or conscience. Individuals with trauma histories may be drawn to shadow work before establishing sufficient ego strength to undertake it safely. The teachings themselves are not responsible for these problematic attractions, but responsible practitioners must recognize that not everyone who approaches the path is genuinely suited for its demands. The question of when to seek conventional psychological help rather than persisting with spiritual practice becomes critically important. Left-hand path communities sometimes exhibit suspicion toward mainstream psychology, viewing it as another form of social control that pathologizes experiences outside normal range. This suspicion contains some truth, as psychiatry has historically labeled as illness states that other cultures recognize as spiritual emergence. Yet this legitimate critique should not prevent practitioners from recognizing when they genuinely need professional intervention for conditions that will not resolve through magical practice alone. Discernment between spiritual crisis and psychological breakdown requires honest self-assessment and often outside perspective from trusted others. If the practitioner can maintain functioning in daily life, if they retain capacity for self-reflection and course correction, if the difficult states they experience seem to be moving toward resolution or integration, these suggest spiritual crisis that may lead to growth. If functioning collapses entirely, if capacity for self-reflection disappears, if states worsen progressively without sign of resolution, these indicate need for professional help, regardless of spiritual interpretations of the experience. The development of personal ethical codes must include explicit consideration of how the practitioner will recognize and respond to these various risks. What safeguards will prevent inflation? How will one maintain connection to feedback that challenges comfortable self-perceptions? What boundaries will govern sexual expression and substance use? Under what conditions will one seek professional help? These questions require specific answers worked out in advance, as the moments when such safeguards become necessary are precisely when judgment may be most compromised. The ethics that emerge from serious left-hand path practice often prove more rigorous than conventional morality precisely because they cannot rely on external enforcement. The practitioner must develop internal compass calibrated through experience, must cultivate capacity to recognize consequences of actions before they manifest, must maintain commitment to personal standards without external monitoring or punishment. This demands level of moral maturity that many never achieve, which explains why authentic left-hand path practitioners remain rare while many claim the label without doing the necessary work. The path forward requires neither accepting conventional morality uncritically nor rejecting all ethical constraints as arbitrary impositions. Instead, the practitioner must engage in ongoing process of ethical development, refining personal moral code through experience, remaining open to recognizing when current framework proves inadequate, accepting responsibility for all consequences of choices made. This proves far more difficult than either blind obedience or simple rebellion, yet it represents the only approach consistent with genuine individual sovereignty and the goal of conscious self-creation that defines the leftward way. The theoretical frameworks and ethical considerations that structure left-hand path philosophy find their actualization through specific practices, techniques refined over centuries of experimentation by those willing to walk the forbidden road. These methods range from simple daily exercises accessible to beginners through elaborate rituals requiring years of training, from meditation practices adapted from Eastern traditions through uniquely Western magical operations, from solo work undertaken in private to group workings that amplify individual efforts through collective focus. Understanding the practical dimension transforms left-hand path from abstract philosophy into lived experience, from intellectual position into embodied transformation. Meditation forms the foundation for nearly all serious practice, though leftward approaches to meditation differ significantly from right-hand methods in both technique and intention. Where the Buddhist practitioner cultivates awareness to recognize the empty nature of self and phenomena, the left-hand path meditator uses similar techniques to strengthen and stabilize individual consciousness. The object is not dissolution but crystallization, not transcendence but intensification, not emptying but filling consciousness with deliberate focus and developed capacity. This subtle difference in intention produces dramatically different results, despite superficially similar practices. The basic technique begins with establishing stable attention, typically through focus on breath or other neutral object. The practitioner observes without attempting to control, notices when attention wanders and gently returns it to chosen focus, develops capacity for sustained concentration without mental strain or forced effort. This preliminary training strengthens the will, cultivates mental stability, and creates the attentional capacity required for more advanced work. Many practitioners find this stage tedious, wanting to rush forward to dramatic rituals or exotic techniques. Yet without this foundation, the more advanced practices remain unstable or produce only theatrical effects rather than genuine transformation. Once basic concentration stabilizes, the practitioner begins working with visualization, creating and maintaining mental images with increasing clarity and stability. Simple geometric forms provide initial training objects, a triangle, circle, or square held steady in mind's eye without wavering or fading. As capacity develops, the images become more complex, three-dimensional objects, moving forms, entire scenes maintained with sensory detail, including color, texture, sound, and even scent. This training proves essential for ceremonial magic, where the practitioner must visualize entities, symbols, and ritual spaces with such clarity that they temporarily acquire experiential reality. Energy work adds another dimension to meditation practice, cultivating awareness of subtle forces that most people never consciously perceive. Different traditions use various models to describe these energies: the chakra system from yoga, the middle pillar from Kabbalah, the meridian system from Chinese medicine, or entirely pragmatic approaches that work with energy without committing to particular theoretical framework. The practitioner learns to sense energy flows within their own body, to direct and concentrate these forces through intention and visualization, to exchange energy with environment and other beings. The cultivation of Kundalini, or serpent power, represents one of the most potent and dangerous forms of energy work. Traditional Tantric systems approached Kundalini with extreme caution, requiring years of preliminary practice before attempting to activate this force. The energy, described as coiled at the base of the spine like a sleeping serpent, could be aroused through specific practices and directed upward through the chakras to produce states of expanded consciousness and, potentially, permanent spiritual transformation. Yet premature arousal or improper guidance could generate severe psychological and physical symptoms, uncontrollable energetic experiences, destabilization of personality structures, even psychotic breaks. The left-hand path approach to Kundalini work emphasizes gradual development and integration rather than dramatic breakthrough. The practitioner slowly strengthens the subtle body through preliminary practices before attempting to fully activate the serpent force. When arousal occurs, it happens within context of stable psychological foundation and sufficient understanding to navigate the transformative states it produces. This conservative approach frustrates those seeking rapid advancement, but prevents the casualties that result from premature or reckless practice. Ritual work provides structure for channeling developed capacities toward specific intentions, transforming raw ability into focused operations. The basic ritual structure derives from ceremonial magic traditions, but can be adapted to individual preferences and theoretical frameworks. The practitioner establishes sacred space through banishing or cleansing procedures, invokes specific forces or aspects of consciousness appropriate to the working's intention, performs the central operation, which might involve charging sigils, pathworking through symbolic landscapes, or communing with entities, then grounds and closes the space to prevent energies from bleeding into ordinary consciousness. The performance of rituals serves multiple functions simultaneously. At the obvious level, it focuses will and intention toward desired outcomes, marshalling psychological resources and directing them with precision impossible in ordinary states. More subtly, ritual reprograms consciousness itself, installing new patterns of thought and perception through repeated symbolic action. The symbols and gestures function as commands to the unconscious mind, gradually reshaping the deep structures that generate experience and behavior. Over time, the ritual magician literally reconstructs their consciousness according to chosen blueprint, rather than accepting default configurations installed by accident of birth and socialization. Working with entities represents one of the most controversial aspects of left-hand path practice, raising questions about the ontological status of gods, demons, and other beings encountered during magical work. The pragmatic stance treats this question as ultimately unanswerable and functionally irrelevant. Whether entities exist as independent intelligences or as autonomous complexes within collective, unconscious matters, less than whether working with them produces results. The practitioner learns to interact with these beings as if they were real, while maintaining philosophical agnosticism about their ultimate nature. The darker deities and demoniac forces that appear throughout left-hand path practice demand particular attention and respect. These are not the sanitized spiritual beings of popular religion, but raw powers that can destabilize consciousness if approached carelessly. Hecate, Set, Kali, Lilith, the clifothic forces of the shadow tree, demons from medieval grimoires. These entities, or archetypes, represent aspects of reality that conventional religion attempts to exclude, energies that can destroy as easily as transform. Working with them requires psychological stability, clear intention, and recognition that one summons forces beyond comfortable control. The relationship between practitioner and entity evolves through stages. Initial contacts often feel like pure imagination, mental constructs generated by one's own psyche. With continued work, the entities begin displaying autonomous behavior, responding in unexpected ways, providing information the practitioner consciously did not know. Whether this represents access to unconscious knowledge, contact with collective archetypal structures, or genuine communication with independent beings becomes less important than learning to work effectively with the relationship. The practitioner, who demands absolute ontological certainty before proceeding, will never advance, while those who work pragmatically develop capacities regardless of ultimate explanations. The practice of evocation, summoning entities into visible or at least perceptible manifestation, represents advanced work requiring extensive preparation. Traditional grimoires described elaborate procedures involving precisely timed operations, complex symbol systems, conjurations in Hebrew or Latin, even blood sacrifice in some cases. Contemporary practice often simplifies these requirements while maintaining the essential psychological structure, establishing sacred space, calling the entity with appropriate symbols and names, engaging in dialogue or communion, dismissing the entity, and closing the space. The successful evocation produces genuine alterations in consciousness and environment, experiences that cannot be reduced to simple imagination even when interpreted through psychological rather than supernatural frameworks. The importance of psychological stability throughout this work cannot be overstated. The practices deliberately destabilize ordinary consciousness, confront shadow material, work with energies and entities that can overwhelm fragile psyches. The practitioner must establish firm foundation in ordinary reality before exploring non-ordinary territories, must maintain functioning in daily life, even while pursuing extraordinary experiences, must develop capacity to move between states without becoming trapped in either mundane limitation or magical inflation. This requires what might be called psychological flexibility, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing into single, rigid viewpoint. Discernment separates genuine spiritual development from pathological inflation or simple delusion. The practitioner must constantly assess whether experiences represent authentic growth or mere psychological noise, whether insights come from genuine understanding or from ego defending itself through spiritual bypass. This proves extraordinarily difficult because the inflated ego will generate seemingly profound experiences that confirm its grandiosity. The shadow will masquerade as higher self to avoid integration, and genuine spiritual emergence often looks indistinguishable from breakdown to external observers. Several indicators help distinguish authentic progress from problematic developments. Genuine advancement typically produces increased capacity in ordinary life, better emotional regulation, more effective action toward goals, improved relationships, enhanced creative output. Inflation or delusion tends to correlate with deteriorating function, isolation from others, grandiose claims disconnected from demonstrable ability, increasing rigidity and defensiveness, declining capacity for self-reflection. The practitioner who claims extraordinary attainment while unable to maintain basic life responsibilities likely suffers from inflation rather than achievement. The difference between discernment and blind rebellion also proves critical. The rebellious phase that often draws people initially to left-hand path practice must eventually mature into discriminating wisdom. The teenager who rejects all authority because authority offends their sense of autonomy has not achieved genuine sovereignty but remains reactive, still defined by what they oppose rather than what they affirm. True discernment means evaluating each situation on its merits, sometimes recognizing that conventional wisdom proves correct, other times identifying where received opinion fails and must be transcended. This mature discrimination allows the practitioner to learn from any source without feeling their sovereignty threatened. The leftward magician can study right-hand traditions, can appreciate conventional morality's legitimate functions, can recognize wisdom in systems they ultimately reject, all without compromising their fundamental commitment to individual will and consciousness development. The inability to acknowledge value in opposing viewpoints typically signals incomplete individuation, consciousness still trapped in adolescent rebellion rather than established in genuine independence. Physical practices support the consciousness work, maintaining the vehicle through which awareness operates. Yoga, martial arts, dance, or other somatic disciplines develop body awareness and integrate physical and subtle dimensions of being. The practitioner who neglects embodiment, treating consciousness as separate from flesh, creates dangerous splits that undermine magical work. The body is not prison for the spirit, but its instrument and foundation, requiring care and cultivation rather than transcendence or punishment. The dietary practices found in various left-hand path traditions range from the Tantric consumption of forbidden foods to more mundane attention to how diet affects consciousness and energy. Some practitioners adopt specific nutritional strategies to support intensive magical work. Others deliberately transgress dietary restrictions as consciousness-expanding practice. Still others pay no particular attention to food beyond meeting basic needs. The key lies in making conscious choices rather than following either conventional restrictions or reactionary transgression without genuine understanding of purposes served. Sexual practices, already discussed in terms of their risks, also constitute powerful technologies for consciousness transformation when approached with appropriate caution and wisdom. The energy generated through sexual arousal provides fuel for magical operations. Altered states accessed through orgasm create opportunities for implanting intentions directly into consciousness, and the intimate vulnerability of sexual connection can facilitate profound psychological work with partners who approach such work seriously. Yet these possibilities coexist with tremendous potential for self-deception, exploitation, and confusion of spiritual practice with ordinary desire. Keeping detailed records of magical work proves invaluable for tracking genuine progress versus imagined advancement. The magical diary documents rituals performed, techniques practiced, experiences undergone, and results manifested. Reviewing these records over time reveals patterns invisible in the moment, shows which practices produce consistent results, and which generate only noise, demonstrates actual development or lack thereof in ways that immediate experience often obscures. The practitioner willing to honestly assess their records can avoid many pitfalls that trap those who rely solely on memory and subjective impression. The balance between structure and spontaneity varies among practitioners and traditions. Some systems emphasize rigorous adherence to specific procedures, viewing precision as essential for reliable results. Others favor improvisation and intuitive response to immediate circumstances, treating rigid structures as obstacles to genuine magical flow. Most experienced practitioners eventually develop hybrid approaches, maintaining disciplined foundations while allowing flexibility in execution, following proven procedures while remaining open to innovation when circumstances demand it. The ultimate purpose of all these practices remains the transformation of consciousness itself, the gradual or sudden reorganization of awareness into configurations beyond ordinary human capacity. The specific techniques matter less than consistent application and genuine engagement with the work. The practitioner who performs elaborate rituals without psychological foundation achieves less than one who maintains simple daily practice with authentic commitment. The leftward way demands everything from those who walk it, accepting nothing less than complete transformation of the being who began the journey. The left-hand path has undergone remarkable transformations as it moves through the 21st century, adapting to technological changes, cultural shifts, and the unprecedented access to information that characterizes the digital age. What once required initiation into secret societies or years of searching through obscure bookshops now appears instantly through internet searches, with comprehensive, magical curricula available to anyone with connectivity and determination. This democratization brings both opportunities and challenges, expanding access while potentially diluting the serious commitment that genuine practice demands. The question facing contemporary practitioners involves how to maintain the integrity and depth of these traditions while embracing new possibilities that technology and cultural change make available. The internet has fundamentally altered how esoteric knowledge transmits between generations and across geographic boundaries. Online forums, social media groups, video tutorials, and digital libraries provide resources that previous generations could never have imagined. A solitary practitioner in a remote location can now access the same materials and connect with the same communities that once required living in major cities or traveling to specific locations. This connectivity allows for cross-pollination between traditions, rapid spread of innovations, and collaborative work that transcends physical distance. The global left-hand path community that exists primarily in digital space represents genuinely new phenomenon, impossible before current technological infrastructure. Yet this accessibility creates problems alongside its benefits. The ease of accessing information does not guarantee understanding, and the lack of personal transmission from experienced practitioners to students means many work without guidance that could prevent serious errors. The internet amplifies both signal and noise, making it difficult for beginners to distinguish between authentic teachings from serious practitioners and confused or deliberately misleading material from those who claim expertise they do not possess. The theatrical and shocking elements of left-hand path traditions lend themselves to performative display on social media, where surface aesthetics often substitute for genuine practice and understanding. The commodification of occultism represents another challenge of the digital age. What was once hidden knowledge guarded by initiatory orders now becomes product marketed to consumers, spiritual techniques packaged as self-help programs, genuine magical practice reduced to purchasable courses promising rapid results. This market logic fundamentally contradicts the demanding nature of authentic left-hand path work, which requires years of disciplined practice without guarantee of specific outcomes. The consumer who approaches magic as product to be consumed will inevitably become disappointed when reality fails to conform to marketing promises, potentially concluding that the practices themselves lack value rather than recognizing their own insufficient commitment. The integration of left-hand path themes into mainstream culture has accelerated dramatically over recent decades. Elements once shocking now appear as familiar tropes in popular entertainment, with satanic imagery in music and film, magical practices in television series, occult philosophy in video games and novels. This mainstreaming can be viewed either as victory, demonstrating that these ideas have sufficiently entered cultural consciousness to lose their power to scandalize, or as dilution, reducing profound spiritual traditions to entertainment commodities stripped of transformative potential. Likely, both perspectives hold partial truth, as cultural integration inevitably involves both wider influence and some loss of depth. The relationship between left-hand path practice and political movements remains complex and contested. Some practitioners view their spiritual work as fundamentally apolitical, concerned with individual consciousness development rather than collective social change. Others see direct connections between magical sovereignty and political liberation, between personal will and collective empowerment, between esoteric practice and concrete action towards social transformation. The leftward emphasis on questioning authority, challenging established norms, and asserting individual autonomy can support various political positions, from libertarian individualism to anarchist collectivism, to approaches that reject conventional political categories entirely. The misunderstandings surrounding left-hand path traditions persist despite increased information availability, perhaps even amplified by the mixture of accurate knowledge and sensationalized distortion that characterizes internet discourse. The most common misconception remains the equation of leftward practice with literal devil worship involving criminal activity, human sacrifice, or malicious magic intended to harm others. While the traditions deliberately employ transgressive symbolism and work with forces conventionally labeled as evil, the actual practices of serious organizations explicitly forbid illegal activity and emphasize personal development over cursing enemies or causing destruction. Another persistent misconception treats left-hand path philosophy as mere rebellion against authority, adolescent rejection of rules without mature alternative vision. This misses entirely the sophisticated psychological and philosophical frameworks these traditions have developed, reducing complex spiritual systems to simple oppositionalism. The genuine practitioner moves beyond reactive rebellion toward conscious self-creation, beyond rejection of external authority toward development of internal wisdom, beyond breaking rules for shock value toward understanding why conventions exist, and when transcending them serves authentic growth. The fear that left-hand path practices inevitably lead to moral corruption or psychological breakdown also deserves examination. While the risks discussed earlier are genuine, they are not inevitable outcomes, but rather dangers that careful practice and appropriate safeguards can largely mitigate. Thousands of practitioners have engaged these traditions for decades without becoming either criminals or psychiatric cases, developing instead enhanced psychological integration, clearer ethical frameworks based on understanding rather than obedience, and capacities for conscious self-direction that serve them well in all life areas. The sensational cases of practitioners who do suffer breakdowns or commit harmful acts receive disproportionate attention, creating false impression that such outcomes are typical rather than exceptional. The question of what left-hand path practice offers that cannot be found through conventional spiritual traditions or secular personal development deserves consideration. For those satisfied with religious frameworks that emphasize devotion, community, and established wisdom traditions, the leftward way offers little advantage and considerable risk. For those who find fulfillment through secular approaches like psychotherapy, philosophy, or humanistic psychology, adding magical practice may seem unnecessary complication. The left-hand path serves specifically those who cannot find what they need elsewhere, who require frameworks that honor individual sovereignty absolutely, who seek transformation beyond what conventional approaches can provide. The path of self-becoming that these traditions articulate represents their unique contribution to human spiritual endeavor, where other systems subordinate individual to collective, human to divine, personal will to cosmic order. The left-hand path insists that conscious individual existence represents the highest value and goal. This does not mean selfish disregard for others, but rather recognition that genuine service and authentic relationship become possible only from foundation of developed selfhood. The person who has not individuated, who remains dissolved in collective identity or identified with false persona, cannot genuinely relate to others because no authentic self exists to enter relationship. This process of self-becoming, what the Temple of Set terms Zeper, and what Jung called individuation, represents lifelong work without final completion. Each stage of development reveals new layers requiring integration, new aspects of self-demanding recognition, new capacities emerging and requiring conscious cultivation. The practitioner who imagines they have achieved final apotheosis and completed the work has likely fallen into inflation rather than genuine realization. True advancement manifests as increasing capacity, expanding awareness, and deepening wisdom rather than as grandiose claims or cessation of growth. The future of left-hand path traditions will likely involve continued evolution as new generations encounter these ideas and reshape them according to contemporary circumstances. The core principles will probably remain stable: individual sovereignty, consciousness as primary, transgression as spiritual technology, apotheosis as goal. But their expressions will adapt to changing cultural contexts and technological possibilities. Virtual reality might provide new ritual spaces, artificial intelligence might serve as entities to work with or forces to understand and master, biotechnology might offer unprecedented possibilities for conscious self-modification that magical traditions have only imagined. The ethical challenges will intensify as technology provides increasing power to reshape self and world according to will. The same question that has always confronted leftward practitioners, how to exercise power responsibly without external moral constraints, will become more urgent as the power available to individuals expands. The capacity for both extraordinary benefit and catastrophic harm will grow, making the psychological maturity and ethical sophistication that left-hand path philosophy demands more critical than ever. The practitioner who has not done genuine shadow work, who has not developed authentic ethical framework based on understanding, who has not cultivated wisdom alongside power, will pose dangers both to themselves and others. The common ground that might unite various left-hand path currents despite their differences involves shared recognition that consciousness matters absolutely, that individual experience provides the only direct access to reality, that personal sovereignty deserves defense against all attempts at control, and that the work of conscious self-creation represents the most meaningful endeavor humans can undertake. Beyond these core agreements, tremendous diversity exists and should be celebrated rather than suppressed. The leftward way accommodates multiple approaches, various techniques, contradictory philosophies, all united by orientation toward individual development rather than collective conformity. For those considering whether to pursue this path, honest self-assessment proves essential. The work demands extraordinary commitment, tolerates no half measures, and offers no guarantees of success. It requires confronting aspects of self that most people prefer to ignore, embracing uncertainty when most seek comfort, accepting complete responsibility when most seek to distribute or escape it. The rewards match the demands: genuine sovereignty, developed consciousness, authentic power, and perhaps something beyond biological death, but only for those willing to pay the full price in effort, courage, and relentless self-honesty. The forbidden road winds through territories that maps do not chart, past landmarks that guidebooks cannot describe, toward destinations that cannot be known until reached. Those who walk it do so alone regardless of what companions they encounter, for each must discover their own way through landscapes that shift according to the consciousness that perceives them. The path demands everything and promises nothing except the opportunity to become what one chooses rather than what circumstance dictates. For some, this represents everything, the only possibility worth pursuing regardless of cost or risk. For others, it seems pointless or dangerous, better avoided in favor of more certain routes with clearer destinations and communal support. Neither response is wrong, for the leftward way suits only particular temperaments and certain life circumstances. Those called to it will recognize themselves in its descriptions, will feel resonance with its principles, despite or perhaps because of the challenges it presents. Those not called will find little here to attract them, and this is precisely as it should be. The left-hand path has never sought universal appeal, has never claimed to offer the only valid spiritual approach, has never suggested that everyone should or could walk the forbidden road. What it does offer to those who can use it is radical alternative to every conventional spiritual teaching, complete inversion of the usual wisdom, path that goes left when all others go right. It offers knowledge that most call forbidden, not because it is inherently evil, but because it empowers individuals beyond what collective structures can easily control. It offers transformation that destroys and rebuilds the self rather than simply refining what already exists. It offers the possibility, no more than that but nothing less either, of becoming something beyond merely human, of achieving conscious immortality, of walking as sovereign among the stars. The journey continues, as it has for thousands of years, through cultural changes and civilizational collapses, maintained by those who found in it something they could find nowhere else. As long as individuals exist who refuse to surrender their sovereignty, who insist on discovering truth through direct experience, who embrace darkness as path to genuine illumination, the forbidden road will remain open to those willing to walk it. The dangers are real, the challenges genuine, the costs high, but for those called to this path, no other way would satisfy, no other destination would justify the journey of life itself.